Okay, so we're back with part 3. We've set up our databases either on Azure or locally, or in some cases both. And we want to go through the process of connecting our web application to them. So when we scaffold out, when we use the MVC.NET Core web application, we give basically 3 files that are created for us. And these 3 files are going to work together so that our application can use our database. So the first file we're going to use is the appsettings.json file. It's right in the root of the project. So right down in Solution Explorer, we see this file at the bottom, appsettings.json. So this is kind of our global configuration, and it already includes a spot for our database connection. So there's a connection strings area on line 2, and then on line 3, it actually creates a connection called default connection. And this uses just a local sort of in-memory database. So we want to change this, and I'm going to show you how you can use either your local database or you can use your Azure database. So if you have SQL Server installed locally and you're able to get the database created like I have here, we can connect to that one. Like here's my Get Me a Game local database. Or you can connect to your Azure database, your GC with your student number. I'm going to show you both. So the connection strings live in Azure. If you're working locally with Windows authentication, your connection string will look something like this. We'll have the name of the server, which will be local or your computer name. We'll have the database name, and Windows authentication, we just use this integrated security equals true. That means we're logging in with our Windows account. So for those of you who set up SQL Server on your Windows laptops and you used SQL Server authentication, this will be what the connection string will look like. If you're connecting to Azure, then it's going to look more like this. Our server name with our Azure server, our database name, and then our username and password that we set up in the Azure portal. So we're going to put those credentials in appsettings.json. We'll do that in a minute. Visual Studio also has this object, a class called dbContext. So this is a class that's used for connecting to databases. We already have one in our project. We don't have to add this to the project. It's already here. So the file, which we'll take a look at, is in the data folder, and it's called application dbContext. So you'll have this file in your project. If I just sort of close things up a bit so it's a little easier to view, we have a data folder. And in here we have a subfolder called migrations, which we'll look at in a minute. And then I have this application dbContext, which is this pretty simple file here. It's called application dbContext, and it's a dbContext, meaning this file is used for connecting to databases. That's all dbContext means. This says identity dbContext because we're also going to use this same file for connecting to the database to manage our user logins and our roles and permissions. And when this object gets created, it also requires some options. So if we want to connect to a database, we have to provide some options to this so it knows what kind of database and which specific database should the application connect to. So we've got 2 files. We've got appsettings.json. We've got our application dbContext. I'll just close all my other files. The other file that's involved that connects these 2 together is down at the very bottom of our project. It's another auto-generated file down here called startup. So this file, this sets how our application should run when the server starts. The dbContext should still be in the data folder. Should still have this file underneath. It should be on data even on a Mac. So there should be a subfolder called data, and it's in there. So in the startup file, we have a method here on line 28 called configure services. So this is auto-generated code we can use. So when our application starts, we want to add a DB context, add a new database connection. So this code is already here, so we don't have to write it, which is great. It saves us time. And then when we're connecting to our database, we're setting up two options. The first option is what kind of database is it? Well, the default in .NET is SQL Server because they're both Microsoft products. So Microsoft says you're building an application with ASP.NET, probably your database is going to be SQL Server. The second option is, it says use SQL Server, and then where do we get the credentials? What database are we connecting to? Well, that's in our configuration. And in there, we are going to get the connection string with the name of default connection. We can change this, but it's probably easier to just leave it. So where do we find this default connection string that has the server name, the database name, the username, and password? Where in our project is it going to look for this value? You got it, Rudia, in our app settings. So by putting our credentials in app settings, when our application starts, it's going to create a new database connection. That database connection by default uses SQL Server, and then it reads the credentials from appsettings.json. So basically everything's already set up for us. We don't need to connect on every single page like we did in PHP. Every page we had to connect to the database. This happens automatically. It's already here when we create a project with this template. So first I'm going to connect locally. So I'm going to go to my appsettings.json, and I'm going to first kind of I'm using this version. So if you are connecting locally, your connection string will look like this. Server equals, your server name here. The database is going to be get me a game or whatever you called it. And if you are connecting with Windows authentication, you'll use integrated space security equals true. This is not case sensitive, by the way. And I'll paste this in the chat as well. So this is for anybody on Windows who is connecting locally with Windows authentication. You just have to replace your server name here with whatever shows up in whatever you've got in Management Studio. So for me, it's my computer name. So I need GC-4VC8VP2. That's my server. And I called my database Get Me a Game. If you called your database something else, you have to use whatever you called it. My database is Get Me a Game. I'm not using Windows authentication, so I can't use this integrated security equals true. This won't work for me. It will work for many of you. For me, I need a username and password on my local server. So there's my credentials. This will allow me to connect to my local database. If you have the database running locally for our Get Me a Game project, it's going to run faster than using Azure. So I'd recommend this if you have the program installed and your server's running. I'm now going to show you the Azure version of this. So if you're using Azure, so you're on Mac or your local server isn't running, our server is going to be this. .database, and I will put this in the chat as well so you can just paste it. Database.windows.net. Your database is also GC and your student number. Your username will be your first name. And your password is going to be whatever password you entered when you set up the database. I recommended you put in where you were born and when you were born. Okay. So this would be your first name, your birth city, and year. Okay. So I'll put this in the chat. So if you are using your Azure database, there's your connection string in the chat. Just replace the X's with your student number and put in your first name as the username and your birth city and year as the password. So I'll connect mine up. My birth city and year is no big secret. I don't try to hide my age from anybody. I simply don't care. So yes, I am a city boy. So this will allow my application to connect to my Azure database. So use either version that I've put in the chat, whatever works for you, whichever one you want to connect to. For your assignment, you'll have to use Azure. You'll have to use this version. For your Get Me a Game store, you can use your local database if you want to. So now what we want to do, okay, good. That's good, Farouk, because I know this, it is a bit of a process. So I'm glad that's clear. Visual Studio has tools. So right now I have a database, but there's nothing in it. Visual Studio will let us build the models in our web project and then automatically copy those models into database tables in the database. This tool is called migrations. Now it lets us do the opposite as well. That's what I did in the past. We created the database tables first, and then we used some code generation tools to generate the models. We're going to do it. Microsoft typically now is doing model first approach. So we actually have two models in the database already, right? If I open up our project and go to models, sorry, we have one. We have a category model. And our category, every category has an ID that's an integer and a name that's a string. So we're going to try this migration process. Basically, what it will do is create a categories table in the database. So we're going to run a couple of commands, but first we also want to modify, we need to modify our database, our application DB context. So we're going to go there first for a minute, and then we'll use the code generation tools. So I'm going to open up my folder in data application DB context. And in here, I'm going to, after line 10, I'm going to hit enter and put in a couple blank lines. So above this public application DB context, I want to reference each model. So I'm going to make a public object called the DB set. This will allow us to list all of the items in the database. So I'm going to create a DB set of type category that I'll call categories. Basically, this is making our category model, our list of categories. We're making our database connection object aware of it. We're saying there is going to be a table in the database called categories. And this table is mapped to, this is our model for the category. And I get a little error here. How do I fix this error? If I put my mouse over it, It says show potential fixes. And it wants me to make a reference to my models folder. I'm going to click that. My error goes away. And then we need to add one method in here. Again, we only have to do this one time. And I will put this code right in the chat for you. We're going to override the method called onModelCreating. So this says when our models are created, we'll need this in terms of being able to generate the tables in our database. So I'm just going to paste this right into the chat for you. Again, we only do this once when we're setting things up. We won't need to do it again. And then I'm going to save my change. So I've added lines 13 and the method I've pasted in the chat, lines 20 through 23. So now we want to use the code generation tools, the migrations, that will automatically build a categories table in the database with an ID property and a name property. So to do this, I'm going to click on my tools menu at the top. I'm going to go down to the middle and choose NuGet Package Manager. What I want is this Package Manager console option. This is almost like a Windows command prompt inside of Visual Studio. So again, I click the Tools menu, NuGet Package Manager, and Package Manager Console. And it uses Windows PowerShell. It's kind of a more advanced version of the command prompt. So now I need to run two commands. We're going to create a new migration, meaning we've made a change in the web application and we want to copy that change down to our database. So I write the command, and it's not case sensitive, add -migration. Yeah, just a minute, Justin. Add -migration, and I'll call it, we're going to give it a name, create categories table. And there shouldn't be any space in that name. It's not case sensitive. So this is basically taking a picture of our models so it can use that picture to copy that structure to the database. I'm going to hit enter. I'll finish the process and then we'll look at where you would go on a Mac. So over here in my Solution Explorer, it opens a file here and it writes some SQL. It's going to create a table called categories that has an ID parameter that's used as a primary key, and it has a name parameter that's a string. So to copy these changes to my database, I run the command update database. I'll put these commands in the chat as well. So first I ran this command, and then I run update database. So it says my database has been updated. I'm going to go back. So in my app settings, I'm connected to my Azure database. If I go back to Management Studio, in my Azure database, if I click on it and click this little blue refresh, if I expand my tables, you'll notice I now have a bunch of tables here. Here's my categories table. And if I expand it, it has an ID column and a name column. My ID is an integer and a primary key, and my name is a varchar, so a string, the SQL Server equivalent of a string. I also got all these other tables. These are auto-generated. Notice all of them start with the word ASP.NET. These are all the auto-generated tables that are used for storing our users and our roles, basically for doing authentication and authorization, for logins and permissions. Because we picked identity when we set the project up, it automatically built these tables for us. So this is when I'm connected to Azure. If you connected to its update database with a dash, there's a dash between it. Okay. So because my appsettings.json is connected to my Azure database, I've created these tables now on Azure. Farouk, if you want to know the details of how this works, bear with me for a second. And then I need to look on a Mac. If you want the details of how this process works, Farouk, here's the link. Okay, so on a Mac, let's see where we go to run this command. Okay, I think there's an extension on a Mac that we can install. Okay, the link is here with the installation instructions on a Mac. So it's through the extension manager and gallery. We're looking for, under the Visual Studio extension repository, NuGet Package Manager. You can also search for it in the search bar. And then you install the add-in. So you can try that link. I'll see if there is any simpler way. How to enable migrations in Visual Studio for Mac. You can also just use the terminal on your Mac. But this looks like the easiest. There is a NuGet package PowerShell. So here's another extension, and there are installation instructions. So we've got our category table created. I want to also create a product table and then link them up because they're related. What does the relationship between a category and a product look like? How would those things be related in our video game store? Yep. And what would the relationship from a database perspective look like if we have a categories table and we have a product table? They're going to be related. What type of relationship should there be between those two tables? Yes, they'll be related by the idea. Right, Ivan. So one to many, and which is the one and which is the many? Okay, is one product in many categories, or one category has many products? Right, one category has many products. So the category is the parent. One category has multiple products, but each product we're going to put in one category. So we're going to create a product model, and then we're going to add a relationship, that one-to-many relationship between the category and the product model. We're then going to use a new migration to create the product table in the database and set up that relationship with the foreign key, the ID, as Farouk was suggesting. So I'm going to go to my Solution Explorer, and we're going to make a product model. So I'm going to add a class to the models folder. So right-click Models, add a class, and I'm going to call it product. So just like we defined the structure of a category has an ID and a name, we should define what a product looks like. So what fields do we need in our product table? What are the properties of a product? So a category has an ID and a name. What about a product? What information do we need to store about each product in the database? Yeah, we need a name. We need an ID. So let's start with the ID. So it'll be an integer called ID. We'll have a name, which just like in our category model is a string. Yep, Hung and Justin, that's right. We'll have a price. We'll use a double, so a number that can accept decimals. So we've got a product ID, a product name, a price. How do we link it to the category if it's one-to-many relationship? Yeah, we need a foreign key. So that'll be an integer that we'll call category ID. So every product has a product ID, but it also has the category ID. So all the video games in one category have the same category ID. Okay, we might add this, and maybe we'll add as well, we'll add this later, maybe we want a photo of the product. And maybe a description. Okay. I'll paste this into the chat in case you miss any of it. So we're creating a new class called product. Here are all the properties. So automatically in ASP.NET, any field called ID or the name of our model and ID, so product ID or category ID, when we do these migrations, it will automatically treat any field called ID as a primary key, or if I called it category ID singular. So we don't even have to specify this field will be the primary key. It's going to happen automatically because we've given it the name of ID. So before we make a new migration and build the product table, we want to set up the relationship between the two. So here's how we're going to do that. We want to reference the parent class. One category, many products. So we have an ID, but we want to tell the database that these two are related with a foreign key. So we'll say every product also has a category property. So this tells us which category the product is in, not just the ID, but it also gives us access to the category name. So we're saying this table is going to be on the many side of this relationship. So you can't add a product to the database if there isn't a valid category attached. We also need to model the relationship from the category perspective. Every category has a list of products attached. So we're going to go and we're going to change our category model. We're going to add something to it to indicate it's related to the product model. So I'm going to go to category and reference the child model. One category, many products. So here we're going to set out a list property of type product. So every category has a list of many products. So this says our category is the parent and our product model is the child. So we're connecting these two models together. One category, many products. We have one more thing we need to do and then we can update our database. In our database connection, our application DB context, we've already added on line 13, we've got a reference to the categories model. We now need to reference the product model as well. I've just pasted in the line that I added to the product model. And I'll give you the code that we added to the bottom of the category model. So we've referenced the categories. I now also need to reference the product model. So now our database connection, it knows there is both a categories table and a products table in the database. So I'm going to add line 14 to my DB context. Okay. So this line I'm highlighting in blue, that gets added. So now we're ready to make a new migration so that the migration is going to build the products table in the database, and it's going to set up that foreign key relationship. So those tables are now connected. So I'm going to go back to Tools and NuGet Package Manager and open up my Package Manager console. And I'm going to add a new migration. So the migrations, they're all recorded in a file, so we can also undo them. If we make a change to the database and we want to roll it back, we can do that. So I'm going to add a migration. I'll call it add products with categories relationship. The name just should describe what are we changing in the database. Put that in the chat. So Visual Studio, when I hit enter, it's going to generate the code that's needed to modify the database. So we can see it's created in my migrations folder. It's created a new file. It's time-stamped it. Add products with categories. So the first thing it's going to do is create a table called products with these columns. And it's also going to set up a foreign key that connects the category ID to the ID primary key from the category table. I don't have to change this code. I'm just going to leave it as it is. And then I can run the command update -database again. Just a minute, Hung. So I've updated my database, and I'm going to go back to Management Studio, and I'm going to refresh my database tables. And now I have a product table that has all our columns, and we can see it's got this foreign key that's connected. It's got a foreign key that's connected to our category table. So we don't have to change the database in Management Studio. We can just make the changes through Visual Studio. Hung quickly, yes, but I can't spend too long troubleshooting right now because there's still some things I'd like to get through in order to finish on time. So we'll look at it quickly, but if it's not something I can solve quickly, we'll have to look at it together maybe tomorrow during office hours. Okay, the reason, Hung, is because your class in models, you called it product with a lowercase p. So click on product.cs at the top. Notice your class name has a lowercase, which is never advisable in ASP.NET. That's why it's got those dots under it. So what you need to do is rename the file. In Solution Explorer, right-click it. So change, go to Solution Explorer on the right. You need to make two changes. Right-click product.cs, choose rename with a capital, and then inside the file on line 8, you have to change the class name to be a capital. There you go. Okay. You should always be naming things. The first letter in the Microsoft world is always a capital. Okay. Okay, so now we've got two tables in the database. So it's a bit of work to set up. So in your assignment, you need to plan out your models. We're going to make a few more models next week in our asynchronous class, but you need to plan out your models, figure out how the two of them are related, list them in your application DB context, which will already be pre-built in your project. You'll add this model creating method, And then you can use the migrations to build your database tables. You don't have to. If you want to go ahead and build the tables manually, you can. So you can check, new table. You can give it a name and you can just put in the properties. You can do it manually if you want, but the migrations are designed to save you time and ensure accuracy. So you can just create your table this way if you like, visually. So now I'm going to go to Solution Explorer and show you how we can auto-generate our controllers and views. So I'm going to delete a few things we did previously. I have this, under views, I have categories. I'm actually going to delete these because we want to auto-generate the views instead. So I'm going to right-click my categories folder, and I'm going to delete it. We also, under controllers, have a categories controller. I'm going to delete this as well. And now that my models are set up with my relationship, they're referenced in our application DB context, and we've used a migration to build the database, I now want to auto-generate 2 controllers and with 5 views for each. So I'm going to generate a category and a product controller and views. So I'm going to right-click controllers. I'm going to choose add a controller. Before we picked an empty controller, this time I want this option, and you can do this for your assignment. It'll write most of the code for you. I want an MVC controller with views using Entity Framework. It will create actions and views for doing create, read, update, and delete, and list entries with Entity Framework. Entity Framework is the name of our data access library. So this is the library that connects our application to our database. So I'm going to click add. And I get this little pop-up window. What model do I want? First, I'm going to pick my category model. Then it says which data context, which class connects to the database. Well, we only have one. It's my application DB context. Under use a layout page, for me it defaults to views shared layout. If this is empty, I can just click views and shared and layout. And when I pick the category model, it's automatically named categories controller. I think for Mac users, instead of picking add controller, I think you pick add new scaffolded item or new scaffold, and then you can pick controller and you'll get a similar screen to this one. Maybe if you're on a Mac, if you want to try it, you could put in the chat the option you picked, but I believe it's called new scaffold, if I remember correctly from last week. So then I'll click add. We're almost done. I'm going to go through this process one more time with the products. Yeah, Ginelle, because we already have a categories controller, I had to delete that first. I don't need the old categories controller we created anymore. So I deleted it, and I deleted the views, the subfolder called categories inside of views. So this will take a minute to run. And now I have a new categories controller that has all these methods in it. It has an index method that gets a list of categories. It has a details method that takes an ID and selects and returns one category. And I have methods for create, for edit, and for delete. Inside of my views, I deleted this folder, but I've regenerated it. And I have 5 views called create, delete, details, edit, and index. So now I can try these out in my browser. I'm going to go back, click my Shop Now link, because it will load my new category. Yeah, it makes it saves so much time. Yes, there's a bit of work setting things up, but then it gives us all this code. So now when I click to go to my categories index, let's look at what do these auto-generated pages look like. we'll have to make changes. So I get a list, there's nothing here, but I have a link to create a new category. When I click it, it takes me to categories create. It hides the ID because it knows ID is a key. So let's add a few categories. What are some categories of video games? If we were going to browse a video game store, let's list 3 or 4 different categories of games that someone wanting to buy a video game might browse. How would we divide the products in our store? Okay. Oh, Maggie, we should have added rating, but we'll add that later. I mean categories of games. So we've got real player games, so RPG. Let's add that. And it adds it to the database and automatically refreshes our categories list. If I go into my database, I can right-click my categories and choose select. And it will write a query and show me what's in the database. I don't even have to write an SQL command. Notice it's a bit slow because I'm using Azure. If I connect locally, it's faster. So I got ID 1 RPG. Okay, Farouk, thanks. I'll grab that category. Go back to my store. I'm going to create another category. Let's add maybe a couple more categories of video games. What other types of video games are there? Yep, So Young, thanks. Let's add VR. I'm going to add one more. Oh, strategy, that's a good one. Okay, so I'm going to put it in as, I'll put it in there. I mistyped it. Strategy. But I have links here where I can go in and edit. It gives me a working form where my existing content is pre-populated. I can fix my typing mistake and click save. If I want, I can add another one. And then I can click delete. And all of these methods, create, edit, and index and delete, they're all working. We didn't have to write any code. We just had to set up the database model and our database connection. It is really great. Think about how much time this saves you in building an application. And yes, obviously we'll want to make changes to this. It's not production ready. We couldn't hand it off to a client, but it's a great place to start. So we really just have to focus on getting our models and our relationships created properly. So long as we can create the models and the relationships properly, the scaffolding does the rest. So we're going to do this one more time for products, and then we're going to stop for the day. And I'll just take a couple minutes before we wrap up to sort of summarize how you're going to use this in your assignment. So I'm going to go back to my Solution Explorer. And I'm going to now scaffold a product controller. So I'm going to right-click controllers. I'm going to add a controller, or if you're on Mac, again, you're picking new scaffold item. I want another controller with views using Entity Framework. What model do I pick this time? Thanks, Farouk. I'm going to pick my product model. It already remembers our application DB context is our database connection. It already remembers my shared layout. It automatically gives it a product name of products controller. So all I have to do is click add. Just choose product, accept all the other choices, add. So this is going to do a similar thing with our categories controller and views. Was going to do one extra thing for us. No, it won't do the nav. The nav you'll have to do on your own. So it looks almost the same. We don't have a link in the nav, but I'll just change the URL to go to localhost/products. we're going to get the same 5 views. So in Solution Explorer, we're going to see a product section. So we can make additional views. We can rename these, but this is a great place to start. So let's go in and let's add a couple products to the store. Okay. So again, I just went to localhost / products. Let's create a few products. I'm going to click create. And we can see what we get here. So I've got fields for name, price, and look at how it related our categories. Because we put a relationship in the models, we said, because every product has a category, and we set up this relationship, our scaffolding automatically gives us a category dropped in. We don't have to write any code for this. So let's add a couple games. Name a game that you like to play. Just throw it in the chat. Give me your favorite video game. Okay, so WoW, let's put in, what would it cost roughly? Doesn't have to be exact. 120. It's a multiplayer. We'll leave out the photo. I'll maybe say for my description, this is Farouk's favorite game. We'll deal with the photo later. We can always come back and edit. And I'll click create. It adds it to the products table. It even shows us the name of the category, does the join for us. We don't have to write a query for this. Scaffolding does all of it. If I go and look in my database, right click, I can go find my products table and select. And Management Studio runs my query and shows me product ID 1 is Farouk's favorite game, WoW. Let's add 1 or 2 more. Somebody else want to give me the name of a video game you like to play? I'll add it to our database as well. Okay. And Hung, what would that cost roughly? $20. And what category would it be in? AU, okay, we don't have an AU VR, okay. So I'm going to add just these 4. You guys can add whatever you like. Okay, so Liam, I'll add Dark Souls. What price and category would you say those are? So 80. What category, Liam? RPG, okay. And I'll create one more. Justin, you like The Last of Us. One of my daughters played that for a long time. Justin, how much was The Last of Us? I should know, I probably had to pay for it. Okay, we'll even put in a decimal, and it's an RPG. So Justin is a fan. All right. So there's our scaffolding. So basically what we've done in class today, this is your assignment 1, really. You're going to figure out what tables you need in the database. You don't need to create the database connection. You've already created the database in Azure. You're going to create a new project and put in appsettings.json, you're going to put your database, your Azure credentials in here. You need to figure out what models you need and make your models. You need to have at least 2, and there needs to be a one-to-many relationship between them. So you might have like movies and reviews, where one movie has many reviews. In your application DB context, you'll list those tables, and you just add this model creating method. Then you can use migrations, like we did here, to create the tables in the database. I created them one at a time today. You can just do it at once. If you make your 2 models first, creating the one migration, it will build both tables. And then you just use the scaffolding tools to generate your controllers and views. And then you're going to make a few changes to the header and footer. Like we've done some of them. You'll need links in the nav bar. You'll have to change the header and footer, and you can start to play around with the CSS and customize things a bit. So next week in class, I'm going to show you how to make some customizations. So for example, I want this list to appear alphabetically. Or when I go to create a new one, I want this label to say category, not category ID. And I want this list sorted alphabetically. So all of these little changes, or maybe here on my price, I want this to display in currency format. So these are some of the changes I'm going to make next week in our asynchronous class, and you'll be doing similar things in your assignment. So you have 2 more weeks to do the assignment. Most of the work is really just designing your models. Once you design the models and set up the relationships, once you set up the database, that's most of the work, and you only have to do that stuff one time. After that, scaffold the controllers and views, and you'll make some changes to make your site easier to use, more user-friendly, look a little more polished. So that's what I'll be doing in next week's lesson. How do we take the scaffold and start to polish it? We'll make some more changes to the database later so that users can put items in their shopping cart and then they can check out and create an order in the database. So we'll make more models later. No, we did not change anything on startup. Well, as long as I have these WebEx files, the MP4s aren't created. So it's probably going to be a few hours, Liam, before the recording's up. Once they're up, I can send out an announcement. Right, we changed the application DB context and we changed appsettings.json. So I will, yeah, everything else. So we changed app settings, we changed application DB context, and we made our 2 models. The controllers and views we just auto-generated through scaffolding.
Hello?
Yep.
So if this is like so easy and convenience to use and to make a list and edit and delete, so why do we need PHP anymore?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, we don't. I never build anything in PHP. I think PHP is a useful language for learning, but if somebody came to me and asked me to build a web project from the beginning, I personally would never use PHP for it.
Okay.
But that's my preference.
Yeah. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Were any Mac users able to figure out the PowerShell extension? If Mac users are behind, what I'm going to recommend is I have office hours tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. I'm going to recommend, if you're a Mac user, let's have a joint session tomorrow morning at 10. Okay? And we can go through it together rather than me going through it individually with everyone. Well, I've got office hours at, do you have class tomorrow morning? If you want, I guess we could do it at 11. What time is your class tomorrow morning? Okay, I will be in the WebEx room at 11. So I'll maybe ask one Mac user to share your screen and we can go through it. We can go over running the commands and then you'll want to catch up. You don't have to use those commands. You can also just create your database manually. Yes, we're done for today. So if you want to create the tables manually in Azure Data Studio, you can. But I will go over it tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. Mac users, no need to book an appointment. Just come to the regular WebEx address. Okay, I will push all today's code up to GitHub, and I'll send an announcement when the videos are done and uploaded to YouTube. Okay, so Mac users, I'll see many of you tomorrow. Everyone else, have a great week, and I'll send a reminder next week that your class is asynchronous.